Good morning. I'm the 100 Proof News Hound here with another episode of the 100 Years and More Show. Today we've got a good biographical episode. It's an episode I didn't think I needed to make until, well, I had lunch with a few of my colleagues last week. A couple guys in their 40s were there, and we were talking about the history of sports in America, and of course the name Jim Thorpe came up. These two fellows had never heard of Jim Thorpe. They didn't look like idiots, so I thought, well, maybe it's his name is no longer as ubiquitous as it used to be. See, when I grew up in the 60s, our local TV movie host would probably show the movie Jim Thorpe All-American at least once a year, so I probably saw it half a dozen times. And the name Jim Thorpe was just all around. It was just a thing. Every time the Olympics would come up, someone would talk about Jim Thorpe because, well, what we're going to get into, having his medals haven't been taken away. So here we are. We're going to give you the Jim Thorpe story. But before we begin, we would like you to like and subscribe. So hit the buttons for like and hit the button for subscribe. Jim Thorpe, as most of you will know, was a Native American. He would have called himself an Indian. He was a member of the Sac and Fox Nation. And he grew up in Prague, Oklahoma, but not Prague, Oklahoma. Well, he grew up in Prague Indian Territory when he was born in 1887. It was not yet part of the state of Oklahoma. So he grew up on Indian land. And just in background, he was a great athlete. He went on to win 2 Olympic gold medals. He would have those medals taken away. He played professional baseball, basketball, a variety of everything. And what's amazing about his early life is that there was actually a possibility of there being another Jim Thorpe. He was a twin. He had a twin named Charlie, who unfortunately, like a lot of people in pre-antibiotic America, he contracted pneumonia at the age of 9 and died. So we never know what could have been. There could have been another Thorpe. Now, he attended a series of Indian boarding schools. But, school life, academia was never for him, and he was constantly running away. When his mother died when he was 14 years old, he left school for what he thought was permanently and came home for a couple of years. He worked in ranches and stuff around Prague, Oklahoma. But at the age of 16, his father suggested that he attend the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And Jim consented, and off he went. There he would meet somebody who would have more impact on his life than any other person, and that person was Glenn Pop Warner. Now, Glenn Pop Warner, you may have heard of him, Pop Warner football and all that. He's one of the foundational coaches of college football, along with Amos Alonzo Stagg, Walter Camp, Fritz Chrysler. He would coach. Pop Warner would coach at Carlisle Indian School for 12 years, and then he would go on to coach at the University of Pittsburgh and Stanford. He was a major player in football in the early 20th century, and from all accounts, a heck of a guy. Now, we're here about Jim Thorpe, though, and his athletic achievements. The first time he appears in a newspaper for anything actually, is in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette on Sunday, April 5th, 1908. He's mentioned in a story headline, Marlins team wins from Indian Reserves. The team from Carlisle was playing the team from Mercersburg, Pennsylvania, and they would lose 7-4. But in that box score, it has Jim Thorpe pitching and getting 1 hit in 3 at-bats. That's his first time, the first time he makes the paper, the first of thousands, but that's when he breaks in, let's say. And then a couple weeks later, on April 26, 1908, in the Pittsburgh Post, it's noted that there's a track meet, an intercollegiate track meet among several universities, and Jim Thorpe, Carlisle Indian School, tied first place at 6 feet. Thorpe won the place on a toss-off. Well, what he did was, like in high jumping, if you both jump the same, it's whoever had the fewest misses at lower heights. And so he's awarded the gold for that particular track meet. And that's the first time he's in the newspaper for winning anything. He had never played football. Football would become the great love of his life, and he had never played football before he got to Carlisle. And when he gets to Carlisle, the 1908 team, he tries out for it. Of course, he makes it because he's the best athlete in the world. But beyond that team would go 10-1, 10 wins, 2 losses, and a tie. The most important win that year, they played Penn State, which, like now, is a large state school, a major player in football. And the headline from the Pittsburgh Post Gazette for October 4th, 1908 is "Field goals beat state. Thorpe, the Indian halfback, has 2 and they win the game." Now, when you read the box score, he actually kicked 3. He kicked 3 out of 5. 5 attempts, 3 made, and they won. They won the game 12-5 in front of 10,000 people. And what's unique about the field goals, they weren't place kicks, where the ball is snapped back to the holder sets it up and the ball is kicked. These were drop kicks. Drop kicks, that's a lost art. Drop kicks, you take the ball, you drop the ball vertically. As soon as the point of the ball hits the ground, you then kick the ball. Much harder than a place kick, and he made 3 out of 5, and they beat Penn State. Shortly after that, however, his father died of, another crazy disease. Gangrene, gets an infection, no antibiotic, and he dies. And he's depressed, and he wants to leave school. He finishes the year. And as a matter of fact, his football prowess, Walter Camp names him to the third-team All-America team. So he's already being recognized one of the best players in America. But he takes his father's death really hard, and he takes 2 years off school. So he's there in 1908. He's not in 1909, but he does appear in the news article on November 25th, 1909, in the St. Louis Globe-Democrat. What happened was Carlisle was playing the University of St. Louis, or St. Louis University, and the reporter had noticed that Pop Warner was talking with an individual before the game, and the individual looked like an athlete, and he asked him out, "Who is that guy?" And Pop Warner told him, "That's Jim Thorpe. He's living in Prague, Oklahoma. He's the best athlete ever to attend Carlisle. He came here to see the game. He wanted to play if he was needed, but he really doesn't like school. He wants to quit and just work." But Pop Warner remained optimistic. He said, "We'll try to get him back, and if he's got 3 more years of eligibility if we can just get him to return to school." And return to school he did, but not until 1911. When he returns in 1911, he bursts upon the scene, and his first big impact on national sports is when they play Harvard, and they win. Well, let's just give you the background. Harvard was in the middle of a streak where they only lost 7 games over an 8-year span, less than 1 game per year, and this is one of their losses. They lose 18-15. Headline: Thorpe, Indian halfback, kicking placement goal from 48-yard line for most spectacular play of game. He kicked a 48-yard field goal, this time from a placement, a snap and a hold. But he kicked a 48-yard field goal, and he went on and he kicked 3 more, and they win 18-15. The Boston Globe notes, the Carlisle Indian football team ran rings around Harvard yesterday afternoon, beating the Crimson by 18-15. Now, just a comment about how the Boston Globe covers the game. Well, they do a nice job of narrative coverage, but they also go in and break things down play by play. They note that there were more than 25,000 persons in the stadium, and they looked down upon one of the most thrilling football contests of this or any other season. The Indians played with a speed that was terrific, and when they ran with all their might, hammering hard at all in front of them, and by their sheer doggedness, making yard after yard when a less determined team would have been completely smothered. What they included in their coverage, and I mentioned this, photographs and full coverage play by play. They actually put in what we in the business, and back when I used to coach high school football, we used to call a drive chart. And a drive chart allows you visually to chart every play. And so you can look at the drive chart and get a visual representation of what went on and break it down situationally. Well, it's a coaching and scouting tool. But here they are in 1911. The Boston Globe is including a full drive chart of the game in their coverage of the Harvard Carlisle game. Never seen that before. Very interesting. And I think it hints that they felt their readers were a lot smarter than the readers that are presently reading newspapers. In any event, they were probably right. They probably were better educated. Now, team only loses 1 game. They would have, had there been a national champion, they would have been the national champion, and they roll into 1912 as optimistic as ever. They again only lose 1 game in 1912, and it's a big deal. Their biggest win is over Army. And here's the coverage from New York Tribune. Army 11 in a rout. Carlisle Indians take the measure of cadets. Thorpe in on every play. On attack and defense, he is in the thick of the fray. It states, the Carlisle Indians, the smoothest and most powerful football team that has been seen on Army Field in many a long day, outplayed and defeated the Army by the score of 27-6. There was never a moment when the Army had even a fighting chance to win the game. It's noticed here that Thorpe's greatest feat, however, came soon after the second half opened. He caught one of Okai's, that's the punter's, puzzling kicks, dropped it and recovered it, and ran zigzag through the entire Army team across the goal for the goal line 45 yards away. So he returned a punt for a touchdown. And the passing game was already part of college football by that time, and it was noted that the best catch of the whole game was by Thorpe, and with the entire Army backfield waiting for the ball, he leaped up and pulled it down for a clear gain of 30 yards. So he could do it all. He wins first-team All-America honors in 1911 and in 1912. Greatest football player in America at that point in time, but he's also doing other sports. The Pittsburgh Press on November 8th, 1911 notes, Jim Thorpe of Carlisle, world's most remarkable all-around athlete. Now, this is a year before the Olympics, but in this wonderful photograph of him, they have him in different poses. Well, they're actually different photographs from his events, but they do it in a very stylized manner. And they note that he's a high jumper. He plays basketball, baseball, shot put, hurdles, broad jump, football, and is a sprinter. He dominated intercollegiate track and field to such an extent that when they had the Olympic tryouts in 2012, only 4 other athletes chose to compete against him for inclusion on the Olympic team. One of those other athletes would be his lifelong nemesis, Avery Brundage, which is also a name that comes out of my childhood. I remember Avery Brundage as a mean, miserable old man in the 1960s and 70s who was in charge of the International Olympic Committee. But in order to fully do the Jim Thorpe story, you got to know a little bit about Avery Brundage. Avery Brundage was born in Detroit in 1887, middle-class family, had some hard breaks as a kid, but he was a good athlete, a great athlete actually, just not as good as Thorpe. He finished 6th in the pentathlon and 16th in the decathlon in the 1912 Olympics, behind Thorpe each time. When he retires from athletics, he becomes a contractor, builder, and he's working in the Chicago area. The business prospered, and he becomes tremendously wealthy. In articles in the 1960 press, it's noted that he has a fortune that would translate in today's dollars of well over $100 million. And in fact, has an Asian art, get a load of this as being a swell, got an Asian art collection. He went to Hong Kong and Japan collecting things. He's got such a collection that in his mansion, he has a full-time PhD curator. He has a curator of his collection on staff, full-time just for him. Now, why Avery Brundage is important beyond his athletic accomplishments is he was the 20th century's biggest endorser and champion of the concept of amateurism. Now, amateurism really comes into play in the next segment of our story. But what you have to realize, several things you have to realize. First off, there were no amateurs in Greek athletics. When we go back to the original Olympic Games, the winner of the events would be heralded all praise. He'd get a wreath. He wouldn't get a check. But that man would never have to pay for a meal the rest of his life. There would be endorsements. He'd be supported by patrons. You became a wealthy, prominent man by winning in the Olympic Games. The concept that you couldn't make money off of your Olympic win or off of any of your athletic wins was totally foreign to the ancient Greeks. They didn't even have a word for it. The word amateur basically means love of the game. It has nothing to do with whether you're making money. The modern concept of an amateur is a purely Victorian construct. And by that, it was a way to exclude the lower classes. The upper classes, who controlled everything in mid-19th century Britain, instituted, with respect to association football, instituted rules that prohibited, initially prohibited anybody who made a living with their hands, anybody who was a laborer from playing in association football. Now, that was too much even for the people of the time. So after a few years, they modified that and just said, if you have made any money playing any sport at any time, you are not allowed to play in our, quote, amateur love of the game association football league. And that was the prevailing thought in athletics in the late 1800s and going into the 1890s when they're thinking of reconstituting the Olympic Games. And that concept of amateurism carried through. But it was recent. That whole concept of amateurism had only been in existence for 30 years by the time Jim Thorpe runs afoul of what we'll see in just a minute here. And its biggest champion in North America was Avery Brundage. Now, Avery Brundage, as the swell, could afford such a thing. Think about it this way. They now have that concept of the 10,000 hour rule, that if you really want to become good at something, you want to become a great free throw shooter, you got to shoot free throws 10,000 hours of free throw shooting. 10,000 hours is 40 hours a day for 10,000, it's like 40 hours a day 40 hours a week for the whole year. Who can do that? You can only do that if you're independently wealthy or being sponsored by somebody. But if you take money for it, you're no longer an amateur, and according to Avery Brundage, you can't participate in sports. But Brundage was I wouldn't know if it's a hypocrite or fool. He drew a distinction. If you were an athlete and being sponsored by government, and by government we mean the communist governments of East Germany, Poland, Hungary, the Soviet Union, China. They could keep you on their payroll and pay for all of your accommodation and all your travel, and you would still be an amateur. But if you did the same thing for the Nestle Corporation in Switzerland, you're a professional. If you take $1 from the private sector, you are a professional. If you take $10,000 from the public sector, you're fine. Nonsense, total nonsense. That whole concept of amateurism would break down shortly after Avery Brundage's death in 1975. You know, Avery Brundage was such a swell that his third wife was an actual European princess, an actual princess. And this is the guy who we'll see here to a great extent is deciding Jim Thorpe's fate. Now, gotta have the highs before you get the lows, and the highs are this. He goes off to the Olympic Games and he wins the pentathlon and the decathlon, the 5-event and the 10-event all-around athletic championship. New York Times headline, July 21, 1912, Thorpe is the world's greatest athlete. Fox Indian, a marvelous man in many forms of sport. Their article states, as the mightiest athlete at the recent Olympic Games in Stockholm, through his winning of the pentathlon and decathlon, the 5-event and 10-event contests, the world had never seen such a marvel of physical strength as was embodied in James Thorpe. It has also been stated by several writers that Goliath and some fabled strongmen of history could hardly have competed successfully with Thorpe as an all-around athlete, that despite their great strength, they lacked the further combination of speed and agility. Pretty high praise. King Gustav of Sweden, who was hosting the games, upon meeting Thorpe said, "You, sir, are the greatest athlete in the world." To which Jim replied, "Thanks, King." But the it was about to hit the fan. And by the it, that means, what I mean is, well, there were rumors that were then later substantiated that Jim had played semi-pro baseball in 1909 and 1910 in the summers, earning a few dollars per game. He stated he needed the money to support his, to assist him in returning to Carlisle School. But per the strict rules of amateurism, Jim was a professional and ineligible to participate in the Olympic Games. Headline, the New York Evening World, January 28, 1913. Thorpe, Olympic hero, makes full confession that he is a professional. Jim Thorpe confesses that he is a professional and that he was a professional at the time he competed for the United States in the International Olympic Games at Stockholm last summer. It's one of the biggest sensations in the history of sports. The prompt apology of the Amateur Olympic Committee lessens the force of the blow in a sportsmanlike way that evens up the situation. Now, does it really? Now, there's always been this sort of background racism in the Jim Thorpe story. But when you read the articles, aside from just referring to him as an Indian, as soon as he becomes prominent in sports, he's totally, by the press, he's totally accepted. And there's nothing to indicate that he wasn't accepted by the general public. Just think of it. It's kind of like Jim Brown, or Tiger Woods. Once you establish that you're the best on the merits, there's total acceptance of your abilities and the criticism. There may be background radiation, maybe some background racism, but nothing overt. The closest we get to overt stuff are stories like the one I just read here in the New York Evening World, which sort of hint that there's a problem with his Indian background. And it's noted that Thorpe will be stripped of all the glory he won in the amateur field, and that includes more honor than ever fell to the lot of any athlete in the world. He is not only a wonderful football and baseball player, but he can do all sorts of record-breaking stunts in every other branch of sports. One of the things here that you should keep in mind of is that there was a rule, and the rule was that if you were going to raise an objection to the results of an Olympic sport, those objections had to be leveled within 30 days of the closing ceremonies. And these allegations of professionalism didn't come out till a good 6 months after the games, and that'll become important when these claims are finally adjudicated in the 20th century. Now, I went into the records and actually got the box scores out of the Raleigh Times, Raleigh, North Carolina, June 22nd, 1909, showing that, yeah, indeed, Jim Thorpe did play for the Rocky Mountain Railroaders, a really bad team in the Eastern Carolina League. In this particular game, he was playing first base and went 1 for 3, but he admitted he took money for the performance of sport, and in the eyes of guys like Avery Brundage, that was a bridge too far. Well, now there he is, world's most acclaimed athlete, but he's got no way of making a living. He was making buttons as a semi-pro player. Even professional athletes don't make a lot of money back then. It's not like it is now. But he's got to do something. So the first thing he does is he goes and joins the New York Giants of Major League Baseball, the National League. He plays for the Giants for 4 years. In the last year of his career, he plays for the Chicago Cardinals. He's an average Major League Baseball player. He's got a .252 lifetime average. He's not a bad player, but he's not a great player. In fact, his last year, 1919, is his best year ever. He has an OPS of 789, which is the highest he ever had. That's on base plus slugging, which is the highest he ever had throughout his major league career. But he retires to concentrate on his true love, which is football. Now, before he goes and plays football, just wanted to give you a sense that he was a pretty good baseball player. And this is from the Boston Globe, June 19th, 1919. Braves 6-4 victory stops Pirates' winning streak. It's noted that the Boston Braves succeeded in stopping the winning streak of the Pirates today, but it took a hard fight for 11 innings to do it, and timely hitting of Jim Thorpe having a lot to do with the victory. The Buccaneers seemed to have the game in their hip pocket in the ninth inning, 5-4, when Thorpe came to bat and smashed the ball up against the center field wall. The ball bounces around, he gets an inside the park home run, and then in the 11th inning, with a man on third, he hits a long fly ball and wins the game. So he was a good contributor. He wasn't a great baseball player, but he was a contributor. Now, he really loves football, but in 1913, there's no way of making money playing football. In 1915, they organized the first professional football leagues in America. It's not the National Football League yet. He goes and signs with the Canton Bulldogs. He's paid a couple $100 a game here. That's the equivalent of like $5,000-$6,000 a game. It's real money. And he plays for Canton from 1915 to 1920. They win 3 championships. In 1920, they join the National Football League, the real National Football League, and he continues to play in the National Football League with 5 different teams through 1928. He's a good enough player that he's named to the All-Decade team, and more importantly, when the National Football League inaugurates their Hall of Fame in Canton, Ohio, he goes in as part of the original class in 1963. He's recognized as one of the founders and pioneers of the National Football League, and he goes in. Of course, that's 10 years after his death, but he is honored in Canton as one of the greats in the National Football League. Now, he retires in 28, but what does he do? Well, Jim goes into the movies. He gets an offer. He gets an offer, and how he gets an offer is kind of semi-tragic. So let's have a look at this. Here's the article. The Wilmington, Delaware Evening Journal, June 26, 1931. Big Jim Thorpe is a movie actor now, wearing the hide and feather regalia of his Indian forefathers. He would have a 20-year movie career, and he almost always played Native Americans. It's a little bit degrading, but that's what you had to do, I guess. But movie acting doesn't represent the end-all of his comeback ambitions. Long an outstanding example of individual excellence in the sports world, particularly in football, Thorpe is casting an eye to the future and what it holds. Thorpe was found by a newspaperman not long ago digging ditches for the county at a $4 a day laboring job. The resulting story brought him letters from all over the country expressing sympathy for his plight and some offering jobs. But Jim didn't see it that way. I don't want any sympathy, Thorpe says. Some people seem to think that it's a disgrace for me to dig ditches for a living, but I don't. I was doing it to tide over a bad time to support my family, and I was on the way to a better job when the story broke. Poor investments in oil wells had reduced Thorpe to the position where he was glad to get a $4 a day job, but he hopes for better things now. Thorpe, a Sac Fox Indian born in Oklahoma, plays an Indian warrior role in the serial film, and incidentally serves as a technical director on Indian matters for the picture. So he goes into movies. He has an actual movie career. According to IMDb, he appears in 73 movies. He's making 2 or 3 a year. He's usually as an uncredited extra, but he has a few speaking parts, almost always as Native Americans. Here's an article in the Los Angeles Times, September 4th, 1934. Jim Thorpe in the movies. Jim Thorpe, probably the greatest all-around athlete of all time, is working in the movies again. Right now, he's busy in College Rhythm, a grid picture being prepared by Paramount. It is unique in that it presents to the public for the first time a night game on the screen. So they're going to show a night game there. The film is being shot at the Los Angeles Coliseum, and most of the Trojan players from USC are employed as extras. So he's got a legitimate movie career, and as I said, he'll continue to work right through to 1950. Now, in perspective, that's really interesting. If this had happened 100 years later, just think of the difference in situation. If this had happened in the 2012 Olympics and he'd won the decathlon and become sort of Bruce Jenner-ish and become a big star and gone into the movies and played baseball and football, forget about the money would have earned actually doing the thing. Did you realize that a Major League Baseball player with 10 years of service, once he hits the age of 45, can start drawing a pension? And if he waits till he's 62, that pension will be nearly $300,000 a year. Just for that. If this had been 100 years later, Thorpe would have been able to draw pensions for Major League Baseball, the National Football League, the Screen Actors Guild. He would have stayed on benefits. He probably would have drawn pensions of $400,000 or more per year, plus had full benefits. But this is 1930, not 2030. So Jim has to work for a living. Now he does go around the country, and he has speaking engagements because he's still a famous person. Here we have from the Sentinel, Carlisle, Pennsylvania. He's going back home on Saturday, February 15th, 1941. Headline, it says, "Get your tickets now for Jim Thorpe Night, CHS Auditorium. The tickets are 50 cents for adults, 25 cents for children." 50 cents, that's like $15. So anyways, addressed by Jim Thorpe, some movies of the outstanding football games in 1940. So he's going to come back. He's having an award. He's having an evening of awards. He's gonna give a speech, and he will be paid for what he's doing. That's what sports celebrities do. Now, 1950 is an opportune time to evaluate the century. And in 1950, everybody had a list of who were the greatest athletes so far of the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century. This article of the Nevada State Journal, Reno, Nevada, January 1, New Year's Day, 1950, is absolutely typical of what stories are out there. It states, "Time ran out tonight on the greatest half century in the history of sports. It was a 50-year span in which playing the game became big business. There were countless stars whose superlative performances made them national figures. The greatest, it's hard to say, but for all-around athletic brilliance, one name stands out in a casual poll of experts and average fans. Jim Thorpe, the versatile Indian, the graceful athlete. It was Thorpe's versatility as an athlete, however, that brought him great sadness. Declared a professional for playing a few games of minor league baseball before the Olympics, Thorpe was forced to return his decathlon and pentathlon trophies, and his name was stricken from the list of Olympic champions. But his name will still hold an honored place in the Walter Camp All-America football teams of 1911 and 1912. He was the only little school man, it's a guy from a small college, among the greats of Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and the other Eastern powers of the day. He was brilliant as a pro footballer, played Major League Baseball, and was adept at hockey, swimming, basketball, archery, squash, lacrosse, and handball in his 25 years of competition. Heck, he's even listed as the 1912 Intercollegiate Ballroom Dancing Champion. Now, all the sources do that. All the books name that. Wikipedia says he did that. I was unable to find that independently verified in the newspapers, but what the heck? He's a great ballroom dancer as well. He's such an athlete that in 1951, they decide to make a movie. The aforementioned movie I had said with Burt Lancaster. And in talking about that, with the spokesman review of Spokane, Washington on January 1, 1950, Jim Thorpe has a few things to say. It says here, Warner Brothers is making a movie of Jim's career entitled The All-American. They've been negotiating with the AAU, the American Athletic Union, for return of the 1912 Olympic medals taken from Thorpe after he was accused of having played pro baseball. Then Thorpe says, "But that Avery Brundage is just a stuffed shirt," Jim said. "He says I was the greatest American athlete, so he says, why do I need the medals to prove it?" Thorpe surrendered the medals in 1913. He said then that he had played semi-pro baseball at Rocky Mount, North Carolina to help pay his way to Carlisle Indian School. Thorpe reported that Brundage, boss of the Amateur Athletic Union, says he can't change the ruling now, and as a consequence, Warners can't have the medals for the picture. So Brundage, the ultimate stuffed shirt, he had it right there, will not give Thorpe back his medals. Now, the movie is made. Jim Thorpe All-American. Burt Lancaster stars in it. It's released in 1951. And it gets, well, not critical acclaim. It's a good solid picture. Kind of stuff they made in the 1950s, make you feel good. Now, one thing that's similar between the movie and real life is that its star, Burt Lancaster, was in his own right a great athlete. Despite his 6'2" height, he was a gymnast and an acrobat. And in the 1930s, he paired with his buddy Nick Cravat. They're both from New York City. For a circus act, an acrobatic circus act, and they did that for 9 years till Burt broke his hand in 1939. And somebody suggested, "You're a good-looking guy. Why don't you try acting?" Which he did, and well, the rest, as they say, is history. Now, interesting, he didn't forget his friend Nick Cravat, who's his business partner. He used him in 8 or 9 different movies as an acrobat. And I always thought that Nick Cravat was a mute, that he couldn't speak. If you go back, you'll see the movie. There's pirate movies. There's basically sword and sandal epics and that. And Nick Cravat never spoke, and so I always assumed that he was a deaf mute, but he wasn't. The reason he didn't speak is that he was from Brooklyn and he had a thick Brooklyn accent. And if he was playing a French pirate, he couldn't possibly, it would sound ridiculous, worse than Tony Curtis, if he had to speak with that Brooklyn accent. So they just shut him down, let him do his acrobatic stunts, but they never had him speak. What happened to Jim between the time of the movie and his death 2 years later? Well, here's an article that explains it. The Merced Sun Star, Merced, California, May 9th, 1952. Jim Thorpe, one of the greatest athletes of the past half century, will celebrate his 64th birthday, May 28th, by opening his own supper club in Pittman, Nevada. The great Indian athlete's wife, Patricia, said the club will be called the Jim Thorpe All-American Club. Pittman is 11 miles east of Las Vegas. And he did, and he ran it till his death. And the building's still there, and it's kind of pathetic. It just has a square facade, and it's attached to a Quonset hut. You know those Quonset hut, the semicircular kind of steel buildings? It's attached to a long Quonset hut. It looks pretty pathetic sitting out there in the middle of the desert. Now Thorpe, well, it is what it is. Thorpe would die in 1953, and you would think the story would be over, but it actually takes a turn for the bizarre. And let's go. The locals back in Shawnee, Oklahoma wanted to build a memorial to Jim. They would have had to raise $25,000, which is $500,000 or so. They couldn't do it. What happened, though, Jim's third wife, Patricia, sneaks Jim's body out of town and has it shipped to Mauch Chunk, Pennsylvania. Now, Mauch Chunk, Pennsylvania has already appeared in our series of shows. The one on roller coasters, it's the location of one of the first switchback railways. But that's neither here nor there. What happens here is bizarre. The town, in effect, buys Jim's remains. They rename a portion of the town. They have it reorganized and they renamed it Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania. Now, Jim had never in his life set foot in this town, but they renamed it Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania. They build 2 athletic statues of Jim in athletic poses and several plaques, and there's a Jim Thorpe Day and parades, and he's it. There's still a Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania, and his remains remain there. The relatives didn't take that lying down, though, and they launched their own lawsuits to try to get Jim's remains back. And a series of lawsuits, we won't bore you with them in their entirety, but it actually works its way all the way up to the Supreme Court in 2013, and they say the remains can stay in Pennsylvania. So you can go there and see the statue and see his grave. Now, there was some justice for Jim ultimately. In 1982, the International Olympic Committee reversed their original decision, and largely on the basis that the objections to the victory were filed beyond the 30-day rule, and on technical grounds they should be reversed. They went to return the Olympic medals to the family. However, they found out that the Olympic medals had been stolen, and nobody to this day knows where they're at. The family were given replicas. It was still in active litigation until 2022, when the IOC finally announced that he would be recognized not just as winning the events, but as the sole winners. In a sense of fairness, when they did the return of the medals or the attempted return of the medals back in '88, they said that he was co-winners with the guys that came in second. The whole thing was cleared up to in Jim's favor, but not until 2022. Posthumously, Jim Thorpe's been subject to a series of awards. Richard Nixon authorized Monday, April 16, 1973 to be Jim Thorpe Day, and to this day, the NCAA awards the Jim Thorpe Trophy to the best defensive back in America. And as recently as 2000, in an ABC Sports poll of sports writers, Jim Thorpe was named as the greatest athlete of the 20th century. So there was no reason to forget about Jim Thorpe. There was no reason for my friends not to know who he was. The fact that you're in your 40s or younger, you should know who Jim Thorpe is, and I hope you'd know who he is now. As always, we will conclude our little discussion with an appropriate cocktail, and believe it or not, there's a cocktail called the Decathlon. The Decathlon cocktail, it's a variation of Bombardier, which in itself is a variation of the Negroni. It's sort of a whiskey-forward Bombardier. 3-part drink, 1.5 ounces of bourbon, 1 ounce of sweet vermouth, 3/4 an ounce of Campari. Mix it over ice, big cubes the best, in a rock glass, spin it around. Garnish this like a Boulevardier. I would garnish that with a cinnamon stick. Enjoy your Decathlon cocktail. Like and subscribe, hit the buttons, and come on back next week when we'll give you another episode of the 100 Years and More show. Thank you, and see you down the road.